Well, everyone, happy Mother's Day. It is something that we definitely want to remember, not only because our culture remembers, but this is actually such a biblical thing to honor our mothers and our fathers. It is actually in the 10 Commandments, and this is a day that we get to remember. And sometimes it's very easy to remember our mothers, especially sometimes when you are a mother and you are really experiencing a lot of, oh, this is so tough, and you start thinking about your mom, then you can remember your mothers. But often, mothers are very taken advantage of. They are taken for granted. Younger ones thank their mothers after they go to school and they have to do their own laundry, have to do their own cooking, and like, oh my gosh, they come home, Mama, I missed you. I missed your laundry and I missed your cooking, right? But this is not only the only day we're supposed to remember our mothers, but this is definitely in the days that we do want to remember and give thanks for our mothers. We do want to remember also that in many times in our culture, mothering is seen to be something that women are supposed to do effortlessly. It is almost a romantic idea that every woman, it is a right, it is a joy, it is the life-changing experience. Pregnant women glow when they have children, and so on and so forth. But often we recognize and we think that, wow, having children and babies is just like the best thing anybody could ever hope for. By the way, that's not necessarily the calling that every woman is supposed to have or gets to have. It's not the only picture. And in fact, many times, the mothering experience of having a child is not what you would think, this beautiful, artistic experience. Oftentimes, we don't even realize that children, when they come out of the womb, they don't look like this. They look like this. Cone heads, all puffed up, sometimes like scratch marks on their face coming through the birth canal. They're crying. They're not like, Mama, like, ah! Right? It's not a fun experience for mom or for child, okay? Especially pre-epidural. Not a fun experience, can I tell you? And most of the times the guys, we're kind of clueless, and I remember generations before, they were even more clueless. My friend's father never had an idea what babies look like. But when he was finally having his own son, he was so excited. And originally they didn't let the men be in the delivery room. After the baby's all cleaned up, and then they bring the father in to be presented to the wife and to the child. And so he was outside the waiting room, pacing and wondering and hoping and praying. And then he found out, that it was a healthy birth, and he's coming in to meet his son for the first time. He had never seen a newborn baby. And he sees his wife holding this baby, and he's like, oh, good job, And then he sees his son, and he's like, oh, right? Because the son looks like this. And he expected the son to look like this. But he looks like this, and he's like, oh. And after a few moments, he walks outside. And the mom's like, what? And the nurses are, what's going on here? And he doesn't come back for like a couple hours. And they're wondering, what happened to him? Well, in his mind, he's going through this massive, trial, this challenge. My son, he's the ugliest baby I've ever seen in my life. How am I going to love him? But I have to love him. He's my son. But he does not look so pretty, right? His head's shaped like this, and he's so ugly, And he was thinking about this, and he's walking and pacing, and then he sees the nursery ward where all of the little babies are put together. And when he sees all the other babies, they all look like this. And he goes, oh, my son's the best looking out of all of them. He runs back, and he holds his wife and holds his son. And, it's kind of funny that the expectations of what birthing and raising children are not what you would think. We all think that we have this chance to raise up this genius child. I remember I don't know why, but we just thought my first daughter was going to be like Supreme Court Justice. I don't know what got into our heads. And we're like training her and so on and so forth. You don't realize that parenting and mothering is messy. It's messy, okay? We like to think, oh, we'll change our babies and they'll be so thankful, they're so happy. Well, 2 a.m, you get stuff like this. Who prepares you for that, right? Parenting, mothering is messy, not just in these kind of contexts. Your whole house is just a mess forever, right? They take over every single room, and moms are just stressed out. In fact, these days, moms are even working while they're taking care of the house, sometimes not getting enough support from their husbands. And so they say the stress level for moms on average, if you ask them, moms will say out of a scale of 10, they're at 8.5 on average. Can you imagine living like that? Stressed out all day long. This is not a stressful day. This is an average day for an average mom. Yeah. Well, just for you to realize, the moms that we have, whether they are older than us and they're our moms or the moms in our midst, they live with this kind of stress every single day. They shoulder this kind of weight, not just in the menial tasks of, what to make for dinner and how to make sure that your family's healthy and raising up children who are not going to be terrors, pretty much. Dealing with sometimes husbands who are more like, a big man-child than a helper. This is the experience of mothering that many people experience. But you know what? It gets more difficult. The expectations of our culture, and sometimes just the injustices of our world. Mothering is crazy because life is crazy. It's messy because life is messy. That Harlequin dream, a romance dream, it doesn't always turn out to be what you expect it to be. And that's what we're going to be finding in the story in the scriptures. That I love the fact that the scriptures, and I say this over and again, the scriptures are very real. That God moves, He honors, He answers in the context of messiness. That you don't see this perfect setup in the scriptures. You see all the wrong, all the brokenness, all of the messed upness of family, of society, of relationships, and even the birthing of life into this kind of mess that God is present in. God is actually hearing and responding and working through even the mothers who are addressing the mess with their faith, with their hope, and their love. These mothers are worth honoring. Well, we're looking at this passage, and this is the first time I'm preaching from this passage, from this angle. And in fact, we're looking at Moses' mom, and she has a story to tell. She has a story of faith, of how she trusted in God, and her trust moved beyond simply just sitting back and letting things happen. She was active. She followed through in response to the injustice, the mess of her surroundings and where her people were. She actually poured her love, her wisdom, and her compassion into this son, who eventually, later on, became one who not only fought against injustice, but was God's vehicle, his means of delivering his whole people, millions, into freedom, into relationship with God. This is the story of not Moses, but Moses' mom. Who knows what Moses' mom's name is? Anybody? Yes. She's unnamed even in the story, so most of the people don't recognize. Okay? Now a man from the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman. Okay, that's Moses' mom. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son. Well, later on in the book of Numbers, as well as in other places in the book of Exodus, we find her name. She is named. Okay, Numbers 26:59. In the name of Amram's wife, which is Moses' dad, Amram, was Jochabed, a descendant of Levi, who was born to the Levites in Egypt. To Amram she bore Aaron, Moses, and their sister Miriam. The birth order, by the way, is Miriam is the older sister, and then it's Aaron, and then it's Moses. Moses is the youngest child here. And you would think, oh, that's great. She's a Levite, and her husband's a Levite. Okay, that's an interesting story in and of itself. But the reason why that's possible is, in fact, because this is part of the mess of her marriage. Okay, Amram married his father's sister, Jochebed. What? That means Jochebed is Amram's, not only his wife, but his aunt. Okay? That's kind of messed up if you ask me, don't you think? Wait a minute. They're not even like first cousins, they're like nephew. Something's kind of fishy here, right? We don't know all the circumstances, but we do know this is not this perfectly set up, beautiful match made in heaven. It's very possible she's older than him, maybe not, because sometimes it works that way. When, like, for example, if Amram's father had a lot of sons over a long period of time, the timeline could have shifted. They could be same age, or she could even be older. So, in fact, later on we find that this kind of marriage is prohibited. So this was kind of grandfathered in at this time. All this to say, this is not the makings of a beautiful love story. This is not the makings of this, birth narrative of this incredible person who would save all of Israel. Okay? Usually when you see God working, doing amazing things through David, through Jesus, you look at the genealogy and it's a mess. David, this great king, most likely was an illegitimate child. That's why he wasn't called when he said, bring all your sons, for this prophecy of who would be king. He was out left in the field. You look at Jesus' genealogy, and it's not a hall of faith. There are some stinkers. There's some turkeys in there, right? Isn't it interesting that God uses this woman, this circumstance, to raise up this incredible man of God, who is not perfect in himself, but God works as a vessel. And I want you to pay attention to this story, because often we will run right through it because we don't see the big bells and whistles. Because in this story, there is no great man doing great things. In fact, Exodus 2 doesn't tell you what Amram is doing at all. At first, when you read this, you're like, it's the mom and it's the sister. All those heroes of this story are women. Okay? And the one villain is the Pharaoh who's a man. Okay? Feminists would have a field day with this story. But I think what's being told here is that, it's easy to just wash over this pre-narrative of Moses' birth and not realize that it is God working through women. One of the reasons why it might be hard to see what God is doing here is because he's not even mentioned. He's not even mentioned in this whole section. There's no place where it says Elohim or Yahweh, nothing. It would seem that it's just a season of injustice and women just trying to scrap their way through. And yet, if you look closely, God is working through the heart of the mothers there. He's working through the heart of the women. And I want to outline some of this, okay? Not just Jochabed, but you're going to see it through even the Pharaoh's daughter, even through the midwives. Those who love, not just children, but who love and are willing to stand up against injustice with courage and are willing to move in this kind of wisdom, God is with. God is with. We see that when she had this child, she saw that he was a fine child, okay? We're going to follow up on that in just a second. And she hid him 3 months. For those of us who know the story, there's a reason why she had to hide him for 3 months. Okay, but for those who don't, you know what? Most of us don't have to hide a child for 3 months in fear of the child's life. But the story is Pharaoh, who was building his massive city and his pyramids, was using the whole people of Israel as slaves. But God was blessing the people of Israel. Even in the midst of their difficult oppression, they were not only having children, they were robust. And they were growing as a people. They were getting stronger and stronger, not just in number, but just as a people. And Pharaoh was in fear. So what did he do? He was trying to find ways to assert his authority and his oppression on the Israelites. And what do? You take away their strength. So he basically told the midwives, and he said, this is my order. When you see a child being birthed, and you see their gender, this is what you have to do. If it's a boy, you have to kill him, okay, with your knife. And if it's a girl, you can let her live. Can you imagine? Back then, they didn't have ultrasound. They couldn't tell you, 4 months in, the health and the gender of your child. They basically had to wait until the child was born. And it was the job of the midwives. Can you imagine if that was your job? A midwife whose calling and purpose is to help women bring children, babies into life. And they were called to actually be the executor of the boys. And they just couldn't do it. They, in their own way, found a way to stand up to Pharaoh. And so when they found out that there's constantly boys being born, and he called the midwives before him, and there's like, you don't understand, Mr. Pharaoh, right? You don't understand. These women, they're very, very quick to give birth. They're strong, right? Strong Russian woman. I remember this one woman in our birthing class. They looked at her, and because she spoke with a Russian accent, she was Russian. They expected her to be like pushing out her baby like this, and the baby should have come out. There's like, you're a strong Russian woman, right? Well, this is the thing. The women are so strong, they just birth their babies before we can even get there. We didn't have the opportunity, and so what's Pharaoh do? He just makes this blanket order from here on out. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. every Hebrew boy that is born before you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. This is a horrible, horrible edict. Okay, as bad as we might think our situation in the United States and where our country might be going for some people that they're concerned about, this is just unspeakable. And in the midst of this, what did she do? She hid him for 3 months. She took on all of the threats, okay, which were very real, of Pharaoh, and she guarded her child. And it's not just her, by the way. We see this recognized in 2 other places. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, in the hall of faith, her and Amram, Jochabed and Amram, Moses' parents, they're remembered, they're acknowledged. Something about what they did was so important that it's actually remembered in the hall of faith. Hebrews 11:23. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Isn't that interesting? Acts chapter 7, verse 20. As Stephen is describing the history of Israel before the people, before he gets stoned to death, he's saying, at that time Moses was born and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months, he was cared for by his family. Something about Moses actually was distinctive to his parents. It says, when she saw that he was a fine child, okay, a special child, that word sometimes is translated spectacular or beautiful. He was beautiful to her. She had 2 kids before, but this child to her was worth fighting for, worth standing up against Pharaoh, worth risking being found out. And for 3 months, she hid him. We might just oh, that's a nice thing. Have you ever tried to hide a baby? You ever try to keep a baby quiet? Okay, go on a plane for about 12 hours. Okay? You know how hard it is? Because guess what? That's the thing that you're like, oh, if you get in the plane and you're sitting next to your baby, you're like, oh my gosh, God, why? Right? Because no matter what the mom does, it's hard to hide a crying baby, right? Used to be when I'd be in those planes as a single person, I'd be like, oh, can't the mom just keep that baby quiet? And then you become a parent, and you realize there's not that much you can do, and you're not angry. You're like, I feel so bad for that mom. I'm so sorry, right? She hid him for 3 months. Imagine the weight, the fear, the anxiety, and yet the courage. What she must have done, the wisdom to be able to guard him like that. It's heroic, yeah. But she's also smart, and she realized she can't hide him forever. It says when she could not hide him any longer, she came up with a plan. It's a beautiful plan. She got a papyrus basket for him, coated it with tar and pitch. It actually sounds just like Noah's story of making the ark, by the way. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. What you don't realize is it's not only that you put a baby into the Nile, they drown because they can't swim, but in fact there are crocodiles. And we know the story of even a 2-year-old in Florida, what happens when crocodiles are near. That was the expectation. But she not only had faith, she was pretty smart. She had a plan. God was working in her wisdom to protect and to further her child. She had a plan. So what did she do? She went, and as she went to the Nile, she didn't just throw him in the Nile. She knew where the princess is, the Pharaoh's daughter. She knew where she comes to bathe. And she planned to put Moses along the Nile in such a way that it would come right before the princess, right before the Pharaoh's daughter. Okay? And she put Miriam, Moses' sister, as a spy. Verse 4 says, his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it, and once again, she saw. A lot of it turns around the word saw in this passage. She saw the baby. Remember? The midwives saw the baby, and they couldn't kill. Remember, Moses' parents, especially Jochabed, saw that he was such a beautiful child, and she hid him. Well, this time, it's Pharaoh's daughter who saw the baby, and he was crying, and she felt compassion for him. Now, isn't this interesting? A Hebrew narrative doesn't tell you everything, but what it tells you, you pay attention to. Here are three ladies, three groups of ladies. You've got the midwives, and you've got Jochebed, Moses' mother, and this other woman, this foreign woman, whose father is the one who's killing all these babies, all these sons. But when she sees Moses, it says her heart was moved in compassion. She knows it's a Hebrew baby. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. And then his sister, that's Miriam, perfectly poised, possibly trained up by Jochebed, walks up and asks Pharaoh's daughter, should I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? You see how this works? I mean, this is well planned, okay? Pharaoh's daughter says, yes, go. So the girl went and got Jochebed, Moses' own mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. She even gets paid to do this, right? So the woman took the baby and nursed him, okay? What a story here is being told of just not just her ingenuity, but her faith that was moved to action. Not only to hide, but actually to find a way to see her son live. It is an amazing story that sometimes we don't pay attention to because it's echoed in the mother stories of all of our mothers. They have gone through incredible difficulty and challenges, physical, emotional, relational, spiritual, in order not just to give birth to us, but to raise us in a setting of where it's just messy. They're not honored, they're not supported in the way that they should have been, and yet they were courageous enough to stand up, they were smart enough to bring life, just like Jochebed. You find that in verse 10 it says, when the child, that is Moses, grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she, that is Pharaoh's daughter, named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. I don't know about you, but I can't imagine a mom taking her child and just giving a child away. You know? It's such a scary and difficult thing. Number one, to put the child into a basket in the midst of crocodiles, even though you know it's a good chance that he's going to be found, that must have been freaky. That must have been scary. She had the faith to trust God for this. And then later on, when he was weaned, to trust God with Moses. Now, whose household is Moses going to be going into? Pharaoh's household. He's going to be trained up like an Egyptian. He's going to be taught war. He's going to be taught all the tools and tricks, how to keep a whole peoples in suppression and just keep them as slaves forever. He's going into that home. Can you imagine if you're a daughter and your son is being sent to the Nazi training camp? You know, what are you going to do? Well, we get an idea and a picture here that she has a short window of time, and she spends that time well. Now, think of it. When he grew older, it says, when he was weaned pretty much, he sent back to Pharaoh's household, to Pharaoh's daughter. But that time frame is not another 3 months. Back then, they weaned their child for a little longer than we do now. So for us, my wife, she promised herself and the babies, I'm going to wean you, I'm going to, breastfeed you for one year, and then that's it, because it's really hard. 1 year, and that was it. Both got 1 year, and on the dot, that's it. You're done. Back then, and now in the rest of the world, children are weaned at age 2, sometimes age 5, right? So she had some time with him. She didn't just feed him. She didn't just care for him and change his diapers. There was something going on. By inference, we realize Moses was being loved and he was being groomed. He was being told, this is who you are. This is your story. God saved you. You have a purpose. She was sharing her faith with Moses. This is how we know. Later on, as Moses goes through all the training, and as he's a young man, skilled in warfare, skilled in suppressing people, because that's what he was taught, guess what? He has a heart that echoes his own heart, as his own mom's heart. He sees injustice done to his own people, and he identifies with them. Verse 11, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people, that's the Israelites, where they were, and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. His mom only had a few years with him, but somehow something was deeply planted, his mom's faith in him, so that when he grows up, even despite all the training and the brainwashing, he still knows who he is. Jochebed had incredible influence on Moses, even though she only had a short period of time. I ran across a poem, and some of you don't like poems because it's not the way you approach things. Some of us are stirred to realize something in beauty of truth through poems. But here's a short poem about Jochebed. Egyptian winds soften as she treks from Goshen. Goshen is where all the Israelites were. She had to go all the way to the area in the Nile, walk all the way to where Pharaoh's household was. As she treks from Goshen to Ramesses' palace and answered the call for a surrogate. Clandestine mother, shadow nurse, she hums the princess's latest whim to sleep. She holds him, whispers eternal secrets to Pharaoh's newfound son, plants immortal seeds. Knowing that they take root, tap into ancestry and pledge deliverance fruit sweeter than chains. In that short period of time, she's whispering who God is. She's praying for him. She's teaching him the ways of the Israelites. That was so strong that even though he went into all of the training of Pharaoh's house, he knew who he was. His heart was shaped to recognize injustice and stand up for it. She did a great job. And I think God honors the faith of women. God honors the faith of mothers like this, who, in the midst of an incredible mess, turn to God and trust him. Mary was only 14 years old. And in fact, Joseph, when he married her, she had the scandal of actually having slept with somebody else, because the Holy Spirit had conceived Jesus in her womb, but everybody else thought she had slept with somebody else. Okay? What a messy situation. And yet, she had the faith to trust God and to raise Jesus well. Hannah, messy situation. She was barren, and she was so heartbroken, not understanding why. And in the midst of this, she trusts God, and she raised a son. She too will give her son, Samuel, up at the time he is weaned. But she used that time well, and Samuel becomes a great man of God. We find that God even honors, this is my take on this. You can disagree, but I think he even honors Pharaoh's daughter. Think of this. She stands up to her own father, and she chooses to adopt one of the Hebrew sons that her father is trying to wipe out. Okay, can you imagine this? What an incredible woman. Later on, we find out that there's a good chance, and this is Hebrew tradition, but we find a little inkling of this even in the scriptures. She actually joins the people of God and comes out of Egypt. Most likely because Pharaoh's like, you love Moses, you go with him. There's a mention of the Pharaoh's daughter, Bithia. Okay? How many daughters did Pharaoh have that came out with the people of God? Pharaoh's daughter, Bithia, who had married. She very possibly became one of the persons in the people of faith. She became an Israelite in many ways, not by birth, but by faith. God honors the women who trust and who mother in the midst of the messiness. Even the midwives. And so God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. These are stories of women who are loving and caring and expressing God's own love to children through their choices. They're expressing a mother's heart, even though the child is not their own mother. The midwives, the Pharaoh's daughter. You want to get an interesting part of this story that a lot of people don't catch? In fact, it's the constant reference of they saw and they were moved. They saw and they did something about it. They saw that it was a son and they still didn't, snuff of its life. The midwives didn't. Jochebed saw that he was a beautiful child, and so she hid him, and she made a way for him to live. Pharaoh's daughter saw and was moved in compassion. A little later on in Exodus chapter 3, it says, God saw the suffering of his people, and he forwarded a deliverer. You know what that means? The mother's hearts are the clearest expression in this story of God's own heart. God sees. God sees the injustice. God sees the messiness and the suffering, but he sees the faith and he does something about it, even through the mothers. As a way of thinking about it, your mother's story is God's love to you. The way that they stood up and they defended you, they guarded you, they gave you life. It's God's love to you. They nurtured you. They shaped faith in you. It's God's love to you. God sees. God sees the hearts of mothers all around who, for children who are not even their own children, moved by compassion, moved by courage. I want you to have you bow your heads with me.